Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the conference. As you could have already figured out from that what Małgorzata and what Simon was saying, one of the main aims of the conference is to rethink and rediscuss the very concept of the regions of memory. Does it make sense to you? Can you link your own research to that concept? Does it have any added value to you? How do you actually do you understand it? How would you use it, if at all, in your research? And in order to help us to link the individual case studies to that concept, we decided to start with the warming up discussion on that idea. We have 4 speakers in our panel with very different geographical experiences, but also with different disciplinary background. We have Jeffrey Olick, who is a sociologist, Kate McGregor, who is a historian, Aline Sierp, who is a political scientist, and Jie-Hyun Lim, a historian again. Each speaker will have between 10 up to 15 minutes for opening remarks, and then we'll have a general discussion. We'll start with Jeff Olick, who, as you have heard several times, has been with Genealogies of Memory project from the very beginning, and whom most of you know very well. But most of you know Jeff mainly as one of the main engines behind the memory studies as they appear today as a global field. But he's also an expert on social and the wider social theory and critical theory and on post-war Germany, and all that probably helps to reflect on the state of the memory studies as it is today. So we would like to start with Jeff's remarks on the concept, then we will have 2 historians speaking, and at the very end, Aline, who would criticize the concept to give a good opening for the discussion. You need to press it here. Mm-hmm.
Press once more.
Okay, so you can take mine.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Joanna and Małgorzata once again for putting together a terrific conference and for their extremely, if not even overly kind words about my role in them. I've enjoyed these conferences a great deal, and thinking through the issues with these colleagues has been extremely important to me over the last couple of years. So I want to just flag how unusual this relationship is and how much I enjoy it. I mentioned my sister a couple of days ago, well, I'm off to Poland next week, and she says, what? Why? Again? I think we just heard the answer why. It's definitely worth a plane ride for Małgorzata's introduction. This notion of regions of memory is an imprecise one. That's clear, and it seems to me, we talked about this at dinner last night, that the task of the conference in many ways is to see if we can specify, complexify, and elaborate on the notion of regions of memory, and then come to an evaluation as to whether we think it's worthwhile, what we think the value added or not is to the concept. And we leave open the hypothesis that the concept of regions of memory is impossible to specify in a manner that would be useful. I don't think so, but I hope that's not going to be the conclusion, or you spent too much money designing a nice title. But I think we have work to do. So let me just tell you a little bit about why this particular phrase, what it's meant to me, and how I've begun to think about it. And I don't know how many of you were at the last conference, and so I'm going to sort of use a couple of phrases that I used last time to introduce how it is that I began to think about this. That is, I started with the quote from the beginning of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, that all happy families are the same, but all unhappy families are unique or different. I don't remember the exact quote, and of course I've never read Anna Karenina other than the first 2 sentences, but doesn't stop me from quoting it. The idea also strikes me in the field of memory studies, because there are so many different different memory studies networks. There's the Nordic Memory Studies Network, which is somehow different from the Baltic Memory Studies Network, though I have never figured out exactly how. There's the Central and East Central European Memory Network. There's the Northeast Asian Memory Studies Network. There are scholars of memory in the southern cone of Latin America. There are scholars of memory in Oceania. And because I'm a theorist, I get to go to a lot of these conferences. And again, as I said the last time, the remarkable thing is that when you go to these conferences, everybody, the sponsors of the conference say, yes, there's memory studies, but you have to understand, memory is completely different here. And so the one thing that I know is universal about memory is that everybody thinks they have special problems with it. Now, to be sure, there are differences between places, but there's also something very general. Now, part of the generality of memory issues has been caught up in what's already been referred to, the field of memory studies, the great wave on which all of us have enjoyed surfing. One of the things that's happened is because memory studies has been around for a while, we've begun to write the history and memory of our own field. And one of the best versions of this that I've seen to date is a 2011 article by Astrid L. In a journal called Parallax on traveling memory. And what Astrid did in that article is she traced out 3 periods or epochs of memory studies. The first is the early pre-World War II period in which Maurice Halbwachs, for instance, although numerous other scholars who get less credit than Halbwachs were originally articulating the social dimensions of memory and the connections between memory and group and collective identities. The second phase of memory studies was the so-called boom or reemergence of interest in memory, both at the societal level and in scholarship, that occurred sometime from the late 1970s through about 2000. The main focus of this second phase of memory studies was the nation state, what Pierre Nora famously called the memory-nation nexus. How does memory underwrite ideas of national identity, and what happens to national identities when it has trouble with memory? And I should just note that a great deal of my own empirical work is second wave memory studies, because I've been interested in the question of German memory. And that started from the recognition that nation states, like other collective groups, tell stories or enjoy telling stories or generate legitimacy by telling stories about their pasts. And it's a lot easier to tell a good or heroic story about a golden age and great heroes, which give you a unique identity. It's much more difficult to tell a story about yourself if you've got something that you are ashamed of or should be ashamed of. And so I asked the question, what happens when national leaders, for instance, cannot tell a good story about their past? So this is where my own empirical work has resided. The third wave of memory studies, however, is one that Astrid and Anne Rigney and numerous others have helped move along, which is a critique of this memory-nation nexus. The idea that just because memory is associated with nation states, or some kinds of memory are, and nation states work to propagate memory, doesn't mean that this memory-nation nexus is operative at the conceptual level. That in fact we make a great mistake by seeing the nation or nation states, or a particular kind of nation state, as the container of memory. That is where memory naturally resides. And in fact, their work has shown through this notion of traveling or entangled or multinational or post-national or transnational memory, trans rather than international memory, that the flows of memory are not necessarily in line with the boundaries of the container of the nation state. There are a great deal of complexities both below the national level and between nations and at a transnational level. Now, one of the major concepts of this third wave of memory studies has a number of different authors, not least, in fact, perhaps greatest, Ostred and Regni, with their notion of transnational memory and multi-directional memory, as Michael Rothberg has put it, but also with the work that's already been mentioned of Daniel Levy and Natan Schneider on the globalization of memory and the hypothesis that there are universal or global memories of some sort, which are in fact in this post-national era more important than the memories which the second wave of memory studies identified with the container of the nation state. And I think that's all a very salutary set of developments, this move from the second wave with its focus on the memory-nation nexus to the idea of universal or globalized or transnational memory flows. But there seems to me to be something that was lost or jumped over in the meantime, and it's something that actually was suggested to me that when I first came to Warsaw to the Genealogies of Memory conference 5 years ago, where we heard very much about this idea. Snyder's Bloodlands had just been published. Is there something special about whether you think of it as the Bloodlands with all the moral weight that goes with that, or whether you merely think of Central and East Central Europe as an area, a space, a region, if you will. And if there's something unique about the dynamics that take place across the national boundaries, Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and numerous others in this bloodland or whatever, whether it's simply Central and East Central European region, that's distinct from what goes on in each of the individual countries, but isn't yet quite global. One of the interesting things, of course, is that this notion of bloodlands was meant to respond to the hegemony of the German model of memory, that there was something that happens among these nations which is distinct, yet not yet fully global or transnational in the sense that's meant by Levy and Snyder in their globalized memory notion. And so the idea of regions of memory was these two elements. One is that maybe there's something about this particular region and maybe something about other regions that are analogous, which are greater than the level of the nation state, second wave memory studies, but not quite this notion of globalized or universalized memory, and that there's some kind of comparative historical sociology that can benefit from this comparison across these regions, each of which, of course, thinks that it has its own problems distinct from all the others. And so that was how I began to think about the notion of regions of memory, these transnational, yet not yet fully globalized areas in which discussion partners were debating a particular past or a particular set of problems with the past. So that's the basic notion. Of course, once we formulate a notion, social theorists are very good at this, we formulate a notion and then we criticize it to death. So the question is, what can we make? What are the challenges of this notion of region? Region is a very ambiguous term. I was actually surprised when I was trying to explain this to a colleague recently, the idea of regions, and the response was, oh, you mean something bigger than the city, but smaller than the nation. The level of a subnational unit. And I said, no, we mean, and then I said, oh, well, actually, I can understand how you would think that. I come from the mid-Atlantic region of the United States. This is bigger than my city, but smaller than my country. So first thing we need to do is specify that when I'm talking about regions here, I'm talking about something that is larger than the level of the nation state, rather than, Baden-Württemberg or something like, or Bavarian memory or something like that. But it also seems to me that it's difficult to define a region solely on the basis of geography. right? So this notion of, we can't even decide if we're talking about Central Europe or East Central Europe, or now we have this big mouthful that takes practice to say Central and East Central Europe, and you can get tongue-tied saying that, and then the question is, well, who belongs to Central and East Central Europe? Does Germany really? Well, maybe it was easier when we had East Germany, because we said East Germany is part of Central and East Central Europe, but West Germany is not because of West. Now we have bigger Germany, and so is it part of it? Is it not? How far east does it go? How far north? How far south? What we see is a configuration that's constantly in motion. And so one of the interesting things is an idea that it can be found many places, but I take the idea essentially from Pierre Bourdieu and his theory of fields, which is that the one thing that is at stake in the field itself is the boundary of the field itself. So one of the things that we're doing when we're talking about regional memory in Central and East Central Europe, for instance, or in Latin America, or in Oceania, or in Northeast Asia, is we're actually defining or struggling over the definition of the region itself. Now, what defines a region depends, in fact, what the discourse of what particular event the discourse of memory is about. So there may be a region of memory here in Central and East Central Europe that's defined by the Second World War and the Holocaust. Or we may have to define it a little broader if we follow Snyder and define it as a period that ranges from the post-World War I period into the 1950s, in which case we might want to define it a little bit more broadly. So what we realize very quickly is that this notion of region, like any other notion, whether it's the nation or the global or the local, is itself a product of the discourse we have about it. So region is not meant, at least I'm working hard, not to mean one more reification like the nation. So we're not simply trading in our smaller version, our smaller, hard, permanent entity, the nation state, which doesn't change and has clear boundaries, and everybody speaks the same language and dresses the same and has the same culture, which of course was never the case, with another one, the region, which is equally as reified and hard and solid, and using it simply a larger container, trading in a small container for a larger container. We need to remember that this notion of the region, just like the notion of the nation, is itself a product of discourse rather than a prerequisite for it. So I think that's one important caveat to understanding how we might use the notion of region as a conceptual construct rather than as a reification. We also need to understand that there is a connection, a changing and fluid connection between the notion of region and the particular event or set of events or period that's being remembered. So if we're talking about World War II, we may define a region in a particular way, but if we're talking about World War I, we're going to define even things that take place in the same geography as perhaps a different region. So just like all of us have multiple memberships in our lives, I'm a member of a family, I'm a member of a member of a nation state. I'm a member of my university. I come from a particular part of my country, and all of these things are true at the same time. A particular geographical location, even a large geographical location, can be defined as part of many, many, many different regions, just as a nation state can be part of many different treaties, many different overlapping organizations. So another thing we have to do with region is be clear that its membership is not defined and it's not a one-size-fits-all where everybody only gets one. But you can be part of many different regions, and the regions can be smaller or the regions can be larger. I think there's a lot more to be said about how we might specify it, but I think I've already gone on too long and surely I'll have another opportunity. So just some preliminary thoughts.
Okay.
Thank you.
Jeff, thanks so much. We will move now to Kate McGregor from the University of Melbourne. Kate, Kate is an expert on the modern history of Southeast Asia, with a particular interest in the history of Indonesia, especially memory of violence in transnational dimension. She is the author of The History in Uniform, Military Ideology and the Construction of Indonesia's Past, co-author of The Contours of Mass Violence in Indonesia, and many articles and book chapters on the topic. Right now she was working on a big project called Confronting Historical Injustice in Indonesia, Memory and Transnational Human Rights Activism. Yeah.
Thank you. Do you mind to put up the...
Absolutely. Yeah. Do you know how...
It did, yeah.
Perhaps. This is yours, right? No, that's one. Okay. Yep.
You can just click when I tell you, is that okay?
Yeah, what is it? Sorry.
With the arrow?
The arrow.
In a minute.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much to the conference organisers, Simon, Joanna and Małgorzata, for inviting me and for also organising the event. So my definition of a region of memory has shifted over time, I think. When I first attended this conference in 2012, I construed the concept quite literally from a geographical point of view. And at that time, my work on Indonesian memory was again largely focused on national or community level remembrance. But I think the conference really pushed me to think more comparatively in terms of whether there were similarities in memory processes in the region of Southeast Asia where Indonesia is located. The conference organisers had suggested, as Jeff mentioned, that we think about Timothy Snyder's work on bloodlands as a way of conceptualising Eastern Europe beyond the idea of discrete nations, and to instead think of this in terms of historical regions where our research was located. And that led me to think through how the intersecting experiences of the Cold War, and particularly anti-communist repressions in the region of Southeast Asia, were experienced and remembered in Indonesia and neighbouring Malaysia. So in writing up that piece for publication since that conference, I realised that just narrowly looking at these two countries, despite their parallel and in some ways similar memory discourses, was also constraining. There seemed to be other external sources of influence on these memory studies, which I labelled Cold War scripts. And in formulating that term, I borrowed the emphasis on common memory scripts from Astrid Errol's work on transcultural memory. In both the violent Cold War repressions of communists in Indonesia and Malaysia, and in remembrance of those repressions, a series of global scripts seemed to be invoked. These scripts had colonial origins, as well as being connected to the broader Muslim discourses of anti-communism across the Islamic world, but also to American McCarthyite Cold War rhetoric. So I guess I found in this sense that using the notion of regions of memory opened up my research perspectives, at the same time forcing me to think beyond a geographic region in terms of understanding the frames of reference for a particular struggle over memory. So I began by defining a region of memory in terms of shared geographical but also historical experiences such as the Cold War. But after that conference, in the course of developing a larger research project, I was trying to look for a more innovative way of conceptualising a new project. And again, I found this concept useful. So I want to tell you a bit more about that project. At the time, as an historian, I'd also been working on a more traditional empirical project looking at transnational political connections between Indonesia and the world in the 40s to 60s. And in that field of transnational history, we're particularly alert to the flow of ideas and people across national boundaries as well. And that field of research made me begin to think more about the transnational flow of ideas and agendas across the contemporary activist world. In particular, I was interested in how human rights activists move across borders, adapt ideas, are influenced by other memory struggles, and especially how they use memory in their activism and formulate remembrance of their own activism. So we can go to the next slide. So I chose 3 case studies for this. Oh, okay. Maybe somebody can help in a minute. The arrow doesn't work. We had this problem before. Anyway, I'll just tell you what they are. I have some pictures later, but I'd like to show. So the case studies that I'm looking at include the Japanese occupation of Indonesia during World War II, 1942 to 45, which include forced labour, forced labour and also the so-called comfort women, forced sexual slavery of Indonesian and Dutch women. I'm also looking at the independence struggle, 1945 to 42, focusing on Dutch atrocities against Indonesians and remembrance of these, and the 1965 to 68 anti-communist violence, which included mass killings and detention without trial. Now, the case of disputed war memory across East Asia is well known, and there are rich studies of memory across this region. Yet East Asia as a region technically excludes Indonesia. War memory is far less disputed in Indonesia than it is in, say, China, but memory of the war and related activism has certainly been negotiated in relation to Japan and sometimes in interaction with other affected parties, such as Koreans, the Philippines, and the Netherlands, due to the fact, as I said before, that Indonesian and Dutch women were both forced into military prostitution during World War II. Further to this, activism on the so-called comfort women issue was strongly influenced by the stories of mass rape coming out from former Yugoslavia in the early 1990s. So the premise of my, next slide, the premise of my research project is that one country can be simultaneously connected to multiple regions of memory. It's possible, for example, to see Indonesia as connected to several regions of memory in a spatial, historical, and cultural sense. In the case of the Japanese occupation, Indonesia is connected to the region of Asia and debates and activism in that region due to commonalities and experiences of the occupation. But it's also connected to Europe due to the parallel Dutch claims re war-related suffering for forced labourers and survivors of the system of forced military prostitution. In the case of Dutch colonial violence, independent and now economically more powerful Indonesia is positioned within another region of memory, together with the former metropole and its European context. The very late emergence of claims for recognition and compensation for colonial massacres, beginning only in the 2000s, suggests that this new activism was possibly a response also to other cases of redress for colonial violence. Meanwhile, the 1965 anti-communist violence arguably connects Indonesia to a broader region of memory again, this time associated with the Cold War due to the fact that there were global repressions of the political left and Western support for these repressions, and also the fact that many political exiles from Indonesia settled in Europe and became advocates for these cases. So in terms of a bit more practically how I go about doing this research, I use the term memory activist from Carol Gluck or memory entrepreneurs from Elizabeth Yellen to think about how activists strategically deploy memory for a variety of purposes, including human rights advocacy, but also more self-interested agendas like legitimation in a new political space. And I look at how memory activists located within or outside particular national contexts use memory for the purpose of achieving human rights outcomes, such as rehabilitation of victims, compensation, or trials of perpetrators. So I'm paying attention to here individual memory, but also popular memory, and looking at the world of art, films, monuments. It's quite broadly defined. And I also look at the personal histories of activists and how they are also connected to particular regions of memory. So the new conceptualisation of regions of memory that I use is far less spatially determined and more imaginative in the sense it tries to capture the multiple connections across the globe, but connections that also tie Indonesia to particular countries due to historical experiences. By using the novel concept of regions of memory, I seek then to more fully capture processes of global interaction. On this point, as Jeff I think mentioned, Levy and Snyder suggest the frequent deployment of memories of the Holocaust globally represents a new form of cosmopolitism, a way in which global concerns become more connected with local experiences, or vice versa. That's a useful way of conceptualising memory practices, but my analysis also of these 3 Indonesian case studies suggests there's a far broader process at work across the globe than the spread, for example, of memory practices only from Western Europe to the rest of the world. Indonesia's links to multiple regions of memory and the parallels that these links have in other countries make it an excellent reference point for understanding then these global memory practices. So my project aims to provide a new way of conceptualising memory practices that is more specific than the cosmopolitan memory, but broader than the nation-centred framework of analysis of memory, which still dominates the field of memory studies. So the new concepts that I'm using, I think, in terms of this idea of regions of memory, lead me perhaps also to a new focus in terms of who the subjects of my research are. And I just wanted to give you some very brief examples to demonstrate the kind of work that I'm doing. So one of my subjects, or the focus of analysis, is the Indonesian survivor Mardiem, who was a former so-called comfort woman, and she's moved between Indonesia and Japan in her activism, but also across the region of Asia. And she's also become the subject of a Japanese film, remembering her participation also in the highly transnational 2000 Tokyo Women's Tribunal on this system. Next one. Another example is a project by a Dutch photographer, Jan Bunning, who has a personal connection to the Netherlands because his father was a former forced labourer in the colony. And he is engaged in a project, if we see the next slide, of putting together photographs with a Dutch anthropologist of Indonesian survivors of the massacre. The third example, I'm just going quickly through these. The third example, the next one, is an Indonesian artist, Dadang Kristanto, who has lived in Australia. And he is a very interesting example in terms of a migrant. And in Australia, at the National Gallery of Australia, he created the only monument anywhere in the world to victims of the 1965 violence in Indonesia, and that includes in Indonesia itself. And he is a kind of an interesting example of a person moving between cultures and trying to memorialise an event outside the context of where the violence occurred. If we see the next picture, his father disappeared in 1965, and he has this installation in the Sculpture Garden of the National Gallery of Australia, which is a reference to the many people who disappeared in 1965, and many of whose corpses were disposed of in rivers. So they are some of the examples of the kind of work that I'm doing. In terms of the new dynamics a focus on regions might produce, I think it also encourages us to think more broadly than national memory, but more specifically than terms like cosmopolitan memory or multi-directional memory or transcultural memory, as Jeff has mentioned. As I have outlined, the challenges are really capturing the complexity of patterns in memory processes that would go beyond the nation, but at the same time are quite specific, so we can still explain their logic. So, for example, Michael Rothberg's work on multidirectional memory is very stimulating, especially from my perspective, because he takes up the connection between decolonisation and the Holocaust. But despite his call for greater attention to multidirectional nature of memory, he acknowledges, and I found the same thing, it's sometimes very difficult to pinpoint cases of exact direct borrowing in memory struggles. So that's a kind of challenge that we're faced with. In terms of how, Joanna also asked us to think about the question of how legitimate comparisons are between regions. I think this is also something quite difficult because it depends on how the regions are defined, how much coherence they have that would allow them to be usefully compared. And the final question that she set for us was, can the idea of memory regions help facilitate cooperation between scholars? I think potentially if they share a similar commitment to reworking the field of memory studies, to also decentering it and to trying to more fully capture the dynamics of memory work. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much for this very detailed account of the actual use of the concept of the regions of memory. Now we will move to Jie-Hyun Lim, who is a professor of history and director of the Research Institute of Comparative History and Culture in Hanyang University in Seoul. He combines expertise in East Asia and Eastern Europe, so he's a very unusual scholar. And among his recent publications, he has published a lot, but among his recent publications related to memory is an edited volume on mass dictatorship and memory as ever-present past, and gender politics and mass dictatorship, global perspective. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna. Jeff, I like your idea of regions of memory as an imprecise one. As a historian, I have always kept a sort of doubt on the precise concept or even suspicion of any seemingly theory or precise concept. So, and in a sense, regions of memory as the imprecise one opened the way to multiple discussions and very productive exchange of our ideas. And then, from this viewpoint, as a historian, perhaps let me start with just a simple question. Does Russia belong to Eastern Europe? or not? Does regions, the East European memory include Russian memories of the Second World War or not? It seems that Russia has been excluded from the regions of memory in Eastern Europe. Why then? So actually, and also the Dostoevsky, in his diary, he wrote a very interesting remark about the discursive location of Russia. In Asia, we have been always Europeans, but in Europe, we have been always Tatars. So Russians, in a sense, in between the Tatars and Europeans, depending where this Russian, the remarks on Russia is located. So in this sense, regions of memory is also a very tricky and imprecise concept. But on the other hand, it is true, for example, let me take an example of Second World War. So if one's approach to Jedwabne, for example, we cannot exclude Jewish experience and Polish experience and Russian and Germans, right? But Japanese army is not involved in the Jedwabne things. So in this sense, regions of memory also reflect certain realities of what happened in the past, right? So it's both yes and no. Regions of memory, it sounds yes, it reflects reality, yes. But on the other hand, also it is very tricky concept to reflect what really happened. Also, I think that these regions of memory from the positive stance might be related with entangled history, right? Peoples who are historical actors who had been engaged in real histories during the course of Second World War. So Polish army, Russian army, Armia Krajowa, and the Armia Ludova, and the Red Army, and the Wehrmacht, and SS, right? All those historical actors actually were actors who formed the memory in the regions. On the other hand, especially in this century, you talked of traveling memories, right? So, but also memories are traveling, but also migrating. For example, let me take an example of United States. United States, in a sense, memory-free zone from Holocaust or comfort of women or other things, other atrocities that happened in Eastern Europe or in East Asia. But nowadays, many memory activists of comfort of women are going to United States, and they have a press conference in the Jewish Cultural Center in the small USA towns. So they try to, make an alliance with the Holocaust survivors, because I think that it's a very, in a sense, very nationalist way of appropriating Holocaust memory in the United States to just distribute or to appeal to the American audience the cause of the comfort of women. So in this sense, as the memory began to migrate, suddenly United States became the place where the memories are contesting and memories are just aligned and so on. So in this sense, the entangled history or histoire croisée, in a sense, give a justification to the formation of the regions of memory. But on the other hand, also entangled memory goes beyond the regions of memory. It's really entangled memories. For example, comfort women, they have never ever been entangled in the past of Holocaust, right? But from the viewpoint of entangled memories, they began to meet Holocaust survivors in the United States. So in the year 2013, a Queensboro, one of the small college community center, organized a meeting of comfort women, former comfort women and Holocaust survivors. And the Korean newspapers had a very broad press coverage of that meeting, because I think that these Korean memory activists of comfort women found a way of appealing to the American audience by using the Holocaust memories, which is quite popular and well known to the United States. So in this way, nowadays, these memories once began to migrate, suddenly it goes beyond the regions of memory. Of course, also, even though they do not migrate in the domain of imagination. For example, in Korea, we have always took up the Gaullist interpretation of the France resistance. Look, these French guys fought against the Nazi occupiers, and they gave just a certain historical legitimacy to these resistance fighters. But in Korea, we failed to poach all the Japanese collaborators, and so that's why our country is so poor and terrible and something like that. So, of course, it's a misunderstanding of Vichy France. But this misunderstanding is very productive, in a sense, in producing certain amounts or certain orientation of memories in the East Asian region. So, in this sense, in the imagination or imaginative memory exchanges, those memories go beyond very often the regional frontiers and so on. So this is another aspect. Also, I think the regions of memory contributes to, of course, deterritorializing memories, right? Which goes beyond the nation state as a container of memories. But what about thinking of region as a certain enlarged version of national container? Right? For example, Europe. I see a certain rise of Eurocentrism, especially in Eastern Europe, especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall. While in Western Europe, this certain post-colonial criticism, in a sense, got rid of all those Eurocentric way of thinking, while after the joining European Union, Europa means, or from Yalta to Malta, means, in a sense, these East European countries now joined Europe, so we are Europeans and we are different from others. In this sense, these regions also contribute to territorializing memories in a relatively enlarged version. Of course, it contributed to deterritorializing memories to a certain extent, but it is imprecise, also ambiguous, in this sense, in promoting both territorialization and re-territorialization of memories within the certain limit. And then, yeah, so also, I think that we need to talk of certain epistemological or methodological aspect. For example, in East Asia, as for comfort women, so the deniers, they keep very strong positivist stance. There is no written document that Japanese army or Japanese government was officially engaged in enforcing this comfort of women. There is no evidence, and just we cannot believe, we cannot trust those old ladies' testimonies. So in this sense, the very strong positivism works out as a defense against the comfort women cases, and the sort of positivism is a very important epistemological or methodological stay to support the sort of deniers discourses in regard to comfort of women. So, but as you wrote in this paper, for example, linguistic tone or a certain methodological tone in the historiography, in a sense, gave us a very good stimulus to the memory studies in East Asia. So, look, in Poland, it's very difficult to find scholars in history who are working on memory studies. Why? I do think, because still positivism is a very strong methodology in the mainstay of Polish historians. That's why these sociologists here who are working on the memory studies, while in some other countries where this positivism does not stay as the most important methodology in historiography, or certain epistemological or methodological tone, such as linguistic tone, in a sense gave a very strong stimulus to promoting memory studies in other regions. So regional differences on the epistemology and methodology are also very, very important factor to be considered in understanding regions of memory. And also finally, for example, historical strike. I mean, in the German context, the historical strike, in a sense, those so-called right-wing, of course, they have a very strong, simplification, discourse and so on, but relativization of Holocaust in the 1980s German context might be a very dangerous thing. But relativization of Holocaust in the other aspect or in the other memory loci, for example, such as in East Asia or in Israel, criticism of relativizing Holocaust might work as a justifying certain official memory in regard to Holocaust in Israel. So in a sense, critical memory in Israel that was run by the so-called new historians, in a sense, they have a certain approach which is very close to relativization of Holocaust rather than that had been criticized by Habermas group and so on. So I think that if we have a look at the history, even the historical strike, in the Jie-Hyun controversy, I think is a sort of historical strike in Poland, as Kłakowski, actually, even before the outbreak of Jie-Hyun controversy, Kłakowski emphasized that Poland or Eastern Europe need its own version of historical strike, right? So I think that if we have a look at this very broad comparison of regions of memories, even our understanding of one historical debate in a given one country could have a certain different or variegated or various connotations which can give us some more indications to understand this memory scape. Yeah. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll move to our last speaker today. It's Aline Sierp, who is assistant professor at the University of Maastricht. Her research interests cover collective memory after experiences of human rights violations, questions of identity and European integration. And she's the author of the recently released book, History, Memory and Trans-European Identity.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. Now, I decided to play a little bit the devil's advocate, and that's why I was put last, I think. Unfortunately, Jeff made part of this. He already mentioned some elements at the very beginning. He started criticizing the notion already, and I decided to go a little bit deeper into these things. First of all, to trigger debate not only among us, the panelists, but particularly to maybe trigger some debate also for the rest of the conference. All speakers said one thing, that regions of memory is a very imprecise term, and I think this is really the biggest problem we have here. If you start just with the term itself, if you're talking about regions, it's not so surprising that the first thing people think about is geographical definition, of course. Regions, you immediately think about something that has to do with a geographical notion. And I'm not so surprised either that Jeff's colleague immediately said, oh, that's bigger than a city, but smaller than a nation. The question really is it a geographical nation? And we've heard before, it's probably not, it's something else. But then we have to think if regions is the proper term, if it's not better to maybe revert to some of the other words that have been used to describe something similar to what we've heard before. In this debate, we're going back to an old question, I think, which is a question that memory scholars have been struggling with from the very beginning, which is the right unit of analysis. So what is the right unit of analysis and how do we define it? It's a question, I think, that nobody has properly answered yet, and it's very telling that we still have conferences about this, because it means that it's not easily to define, that's for sure. So if we say a region is not a geographical term, but it's something else, and the question is, what is this something else? And we have heard several proposals already. One of them is that it's maybe certain historical experiences that define the region, that are particular to that one region, and it's certainly something that might connect different nations as well. It could be certain issues that are prevalent. It could also be the way certain issues are being framed. And I think that's something that
we have not really talked about very much yet, but I think this is something that we might want to think about. It's a framing of issues. It's not the issue as such. So again, sorry, I'm coming from political science, so I'm probably using some jargon here, but we're not only talking about the units of analysis here, we're also talking about the independent variable. Okay, which independent variables are important here that are defining memory discourses. I do think, to start with something positive, that if you talk about regions, however we want to define them, as a new unit, it might help to explore the area that is lying indeed above the local, above the national, but below the global, or below the European. And that's certainly a space that has not been explored properly yet. Now, one of the things that I would be particularly interested in is border regions, okay? So it's not, we keep on talking about regions as being something that is still composed of smaller units, and these smaller units, so far from what I've heard and read, are still the nation states. So if we do that, we risk doing the same mistake that we've done also with the nation state, that we are talking about something that is still very, very closely defined, and then you immediately have problems when this becomes, or this acquires, a political connotation. So I think the geopolitical aspect that my previous speaker has hinted at then plays a role, and it might divert the attention from the actual issues. So this is something we want to keep in mind, I think. The other problem we have with this is that very often you end up in a dichotomy. And the typical dichotomy we have, and I sensed that from the very beginning when we started talking about the origins of this debate, was the East-West dichotomy, saying that Central and Eastern Europe has had very different discourses, and the Western discourse, or the Western ideas that have been developed, do not apply to this particular region. And I think that's dangerous if we do that, because it implies somehow that the West is very uniform as well, and we all know that that's not the case. I think the kind of challenge that has sprung from Central and Eastern discourses, you could say the same about Western Europe as well. You have very distinct research that is being done in Spain, for example. You have a lot of research that is being done, generally speaking, on the experience of fascism in the southern European countries. And the same ideas of, well, this does not really apply to us, is also there. So I think we have to keep that in mind as well. And I keep on thinking if it's not better in that context to revert to something that has been explored earlier, which is to cluster countries and the way they deal with the past according to certain typologies. So it's not so much the certain issues or the framing, but it's the kind of historical role that these countries have played. And then I think we maybe get at a much more precise definition of the particular regions. And it would also allow to explore the areas that are lying beyond the boundaries of the nation states. It would allow us maybe to exit from this idea that regions are made up of smaller units that are necessarily the nation states. So I think there's quite a number of things that we still have to think about here. And I'm looking forward to the conference because I'm pretty sure that each of you will have a different answer to these questions that I've just highlighted. Thank you.
Right, thanks so much. There are a few issues I would like to add, but maybe we'll start a general discussion, and if there is enough time, I will join into it. Questions, reactions, yeah.
Thank you for...
You need a mic. We would need one more mic if you could bring it. If you mind? No?
Thank you for your interesting discussions about these regions of memory or memory regions. But still, I need some kind of clarifications. I come, for example, from the Caucasus, which is defined by complexities in terms of religious, cultural, linguistic pluralism, for example. And we can continue with this kind of pluralism. For example, legal pluralism or understanding of traditions, or how they perceive state or community as such, and so on and so on. So, but still, somebody may talk about the Caucasus as a region of memory, and what kind of typological key elements could we propose to define the region, not just a historical experience or totalitarian experience, for example. We have all the, not just Caucasus, but the whole Eastern Europe were under, countries were under totalitarian regime. And this is kind of a quite certain typological point. But we are talking about the memory, and the Caucasus and the generally this part of the Eastern Europe too is defined by contested understanding of the past. Even real clashes or conflicts are defined by conflicting identities and conflicting understanding of the past. So how can the memory could serve as a uniting concept of the region as a memory, or memories of region? How can we just talk about how can we use memory as a defining point of region? Thank you.
I have two questions. The first one is, I think that almost all of you mentioned about shared experiences, but I have a feeling that if we talk about some regions of memory, shouldn't we talk about experienced memories? Because I think these are two different things, experiences and memories about these experiences. Or, for example, in a concept of a cultural trauma, we see that sometimes we can remember something which hasn't happened. So I think experiences and memories are two different things. So what do you think? And my second question is that I have a feeling that you've been talking mainly about difficult past, difficult memory. What about all the neutral or I would say good memories? Does it mean that regions of memories refer only to difficult past? What about rest? Thank you.
My question is about when we speak of typifying, of creating a typology or defining regions of memory as based on historical experiences, etc., rather than narrowly through geography. My concern is about the question of awareness by the subjects of these memories, of having a commonality or belonging to a community of memory beyond the space that they are familiar with. And in a way, the issue of experienced memories, I think, is also relevant here. But it's basically, are specialists actually arbitrarily, finding commonalities and then categorizing and, in a way, kind of also even imposing it on the subjects, the people who actually remember? Or is this from below and through observation of how relevant certain aspect is for the way someone remembers? So.
My comment pertains to the level of analysis and the extent to which we want to think about this as geographic. I think that there are a lot of good questions about what role does geography play anyway. And to me, it's helpful to think about the institutions and the actors engaged in memory work rather than geography, and use that to figure out, okay, what is the object of our analysis? Now, that may have a geographic component. So, for example, if you're looking at historical policy passed by a parliament, you are looking at the state, and you are looking at nation states. If you're looking at historical policy passed by a European Union institution, then that is, you know, obviously a much larger region of memory. If you're looking at NGOs that promote human rights work, and those are operating at a regional or even global level, then that's affecting the level of analysis. But it seems like the driver isn't necessarily geography. The driver is who are the institutions, who are the actors that are actually engaged in memory work. And if there's a number of different types of actors and institutions engaged in this work, can we just drop the whole notion of level of analysis, because that may not capture the complexity involved, and just talk about who's doing the memory work? Thank you.
Thanks. Anyone else? So maybe I will try to add something to the discussion. I'm an oral historian, but I'm an unusual oral historian, but because I also like reading Halbwachs. And when you go back to him, you see that his major concern at the beginning were the framework, the frameworks of the individual memory. And this is where I find the concept useful. I cannot give an exact definition of the concept. We wouldn't be organizing a conference if you would be able to do that. But as a sensitizing concept, I see it useful, because what Halbwachs was stressing, what was important on memory. Memory was on emotions, and also memory and frameworks of memory were able to make people's recollection coherent. And when we think about the region as a concept, as a different concept than the national memory, family memory, class memory, or global memory, this is a way to understand how people tell their past. They do also refer to some relational things which are above nation, but are really below the global nation, because if memory is about emotion, it's very difficult to get emotional about things which do not concern you. For some reasons, personal or, let's say, interactional reasons, the regional things are the ones which makes the past vivid in individual memory. This is where I would look for the part where I find the concept of the region of memory powerful would be as one of the frameworks of individual memory, one of many, one of conflicting and dialoguing with many others. But this is where I look for it. Okay. So now we can just, I think, start the discussion. Okay, with this, in the same order as we started with Jeff. Would it be okay for you?
Okay. Yeah.
No?
It should be green. I got it. Thank you. By the end of by Saturday afternoon, we'll all know how to use the microphone. So many great questions. I thought I could hold the one or two that I was going to think about in my head, and then I realized halfway through that wasn't going to work. So I started taking notes, but by that time I had, of course, forgotten some of them. I think this idea of framework, region as one of the frameworks of memory is very important. We all have a tendency to make things too difficult on ourselves sometimes. All of the comments, all of the criticisms, some of which I made myself, are all right, are all good. And yet we do recognize, let's not forget, there is an intuitive appeal to the fact that when we're at a memory conference in Warsaw, it's going to be a different memory conference than if we're in Santiago or if we're in Hiroshima. That there is something, that when we're thinking about memory in the this summer, for the first time, I was in Santiago, in Chile, and there was this fantastic museum of human rights about these issues. But there's an analogy to be made. There's something that went on in Chile, which we grouped together with what went on in Argentina and what went on in Uruguay and Paraguay, and there's some similarities there, or there's some constellation of something that is not quite the same as what's going on among Japan, Korea, and South Korea and China when talking about the Second World War or Japanese imperialism or the comfort women or a whole variety of different issues, which is different than when the United States, Canada, and Australia are talking about the dispossession of indigenous peoples, which they all engaged in. And by the way, that last one is a good example when I grouped together Australia, the United States, and Canada, that when we're talking about region, we're not strictly talking about geography. So region can be defined thematically. So many more things. The question that comes out of the Georgian context of what defines a region. Are we talking about smaller post-Soviet states where we could group Georgia and Belarus together with Lithuania and Estonia as nations that were older nations with longer traditions that were affected by Russian domination in the Soviet era? That's one way to do it. This, of course, this goes to the notion that you can be defined in many different ways at many times, quite useful, which goes to the issue of relativization. Who are you comparing to at which particular point in time? So I think these are all good questions. The question of just getting down to just the facts, who's doing what? Who's doing what with what symbols about which pasts? Who are the actors? I think is important, but then Joanna's comment also goes to that sometimes the actors are defining themselves as subnational actors, sometimes they're defining themselves as national actors, sometimes as transnational or regional actors. The participants in this conference, for instance, or the European Network Remembrance and Solidarity, is a regional actor. It's not a global or cosmopolitan. Well, it is cosmopolitan, but it's not global. It's not talking about all memory in all places. It's focusing on supporting discussions of memory in a geographical and conceptual region. So in the Hobsbawmian sense, the region is a framework of the work that the carriers or actors in memory politics are doing. I love the idea of units of analysis. I think that's really important. But again, a unit is a thing, and maybe we don't mean unit, maybe we mean themes of analysis or something like that. So I'm torn in two directions. On the one hand, I get paid for complexifying things and criticizing things, and that's great, but we can do it too much. And so the very, very basic idea here is that we do know what we're talking about when we're talking about memory in the Southern Cone or memory in Northeast Asia or memory in Central Europe. And so there's some value added, maybe not complete and all value added. So we have to do what our task is to sort out those two poles, the common sense that we know what we're talking about when we're talking about regions, and that we don't want to commit the same sins that we do when we talk about the nation state.
Thanks. Kate, would you like to add some?
Okay, thank you. Yep, just jotted down a few notes. So I guess with the first comment about the Caucasus, I don't know much at all about the Caucasus, but I think that the last person's comment might help in terms of thinking about what communities the memory activists there, whoever you define them, see themselves as belonging to, rather than trying to think about a particular region as always been, you know, of one position. Because in my case studies as well, maybe that didn't come out. Of course, these interpretations of the past are very contested. And with regard to the second question, with regard to differentiating experiences and memories, then, for example, in those two cases I looked at, Indonesia and Malaysia, in both countries there is very firm anti-communist remembrance, but there are also people who are survivors from the political left who would contest what they see as a demonization of themselves. So it's very contested, but we can still talk about patterns in the shared remembrance in Indonesia and Malaysia that might have many contested dimensions, but there are still similar dimensions across those two memory wars, I would call them, even though it's contested at the same time. So they share the experience of a Cold War repression, or one of them might frame that in a very different way, but there's still contestation there. And yeah, I think that's about all I wanted to add, or I would follow the same approach. I think it's useful to think about these memory activists that could be operating at different levels, but to also locate them in terms of the comfort women, returning to your example before, to also locate them in a geopolitics with regard to the relationship, for example, between Japan and the US and Korea and the US. The US is not a neutral space, it's also implicated in the Cold War relationships. So we have to think about all those levels as well as thinking about the individual memory activists, I guess.
Thanks a lot. Jie-Hyun?
Just I have kept one question while I was listening to different discussions and the very interesting points. I'm wondering, I'm thinking of how to reformulate Edward Said's concept of imaginary geography in terms of memory studies, or in terms of regions of memory. I think it could be a very crucial question to understanding regions of memory in a much more productive way. So for the next couple of days, I shall think of this possibility of knocking the possibility of reformulating Said's concept of imaginary geography in terms of memory studies, in terms of regions of memory. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Aline?
This just made me think about imagined communities, of course. Imaginary boundaries, imaginary geographies, imagined communities. You immediately are back to something that has been discussed a long time ago. I think a lot of the questions that were posed are actually pointing to another problem we have, which is what kind of memories are we talking about? If you're asking, are the subjects actually aware of the commonalities? Okay, then that means there's a difference between the subjects of memory, or however you want to call it. I'm just picking up your own words there, which would maybe be the individual level, and then you obviously have the social level and the national or cultural level, depending on which scholar you follow. If you follow the Assmans, this would be the typology, these three kinds of memory levels, if you so want. And that might complicate the situation even further if we talk about regions of memory. What kind of level are we talking about here? And it ties also well into the whole question of actors, because of course actors are crucial, and I think it's really important that you brought this up, but actors are not acting in a void. They have certain type of agency, and they obviously are working with memories. So then you have to ask yourself again, what are these memories? What are they referring to? What are the frameworks they're using? It's not only the type of actor you have to look at, but you have to also look at the content, I think.
Would anyone like to add anything to the discussion? Yeah, Simon, please.
Thank you. I'll just stand here. I think there are, to me, there are two directions which seem particularly promising. One is this idea of actors, of political projects, of actual institutions and people creating regions. For example, the European Union, right, is a political and legally defined region which does have its own memory project. Another one is maybe we can call it linguistic, cultural, linguistic. And there's a couple of things we haven't mentioned so much here, and that's language and history. Sorry, not history, language and religion. For example, to what extent does orthodoxy or Catholicism or Islam create, how does it condition the ways of remembering, the modes of remembering? That's not something I know much about, but I think it's a question worth asking. The other is language. So, for example, in Polish and Russian and German, there is no linguistic distinction between victim and sacrifice. Opfer, ofiara, żertwa. And this might, certainly not the only thing, but it might lead to it might contribute to a greater tendency in places which use those languages, and it's been argued recently by Jay Winter that the mode of remembering martyrdom is an important way of creating memory regions. So yeah, the modes of remembering, what we call, Aline, I think you call it the objects of remembering, are also important. And another thing, just to be provocative, I'm wondering if we're not so pleased with this idea of geography being a constitutive and defining aspect, I wonder if we shouldn't just ditch this idea of regions of memory and use the words constellations of memory. So what I use a bit too much, Jeff just used it, so that makes me feel better. Because I think that would be that idea might be a bit less restrictive in terms of geography. So yeah, 2 hours into the conference, I'm suggesting if we should change the title. Thank you.
Just when I heard you speaking, I just recall one more concept which might be useful to rethink when we talk about the regions of memory, which are the memory templates by James Wedge, which are also the kind of the fields of facts which we know, but are kind of similar, for instance, for the Slavs, and are very different for the, let's say, Germans and other, if we stay in the European context. But we also could think of different memory templates via religion or some other dimension.